Hello everyone and welcome to this week's video. My name is KM Weiland. I run the writing website Helping Writers Become Authors. And today I want to take a moment to talk about 8 of the lessons that I've learned over my years of being a writer. Just some of the bigger kind of epiphanies and moments that have impacted me in a way that's changed my life, really, and that's been meaningful on a deep level, and that I think are valuable to kind of hear about and perhaps relate to, or just recognize that they may at some point be a part of your writing journey as well. Lesson number 1 is that story structure is amazing. So obviously this is something that I learned relatively early on in my writing journey and has completely changed my life because I've built a career around teaching story theory and story structure. And when I first encountered story structure, I'd written, I think, 4 or 5 novels probably, without really knowing anything about writing. I hadn't read any how-to books or encountered any ideas from other people. It was just, the stories that, came from my own heart and my own imagination, and obviously the osmosis from being a lifelong reader. But I didn't have any concept that there was systems through which you could view writing and storytelling. And so I remember when I first learned about that, and my first thought was this is amazing. This is incredible, because it absolutely, just made sense. I could immediately see how this was reflected in so many of the stories that I read and watched and loved. And my second thought was, oh darn, I've written all these books, I've published a couple at that point, and I didn't know anything about structure, so they're probably a mess. And the most exciting thing, and really this was the moment that was life-changing, was I went to my bookshelf and pulled out a couple of my books that were already published. And I started flipping through the pages, to get to the estimated timing points of, say, the first plot point or the midpoint or the beginning of the third act. And it was amazing. It was like the structure was there. Even though I hadn't consciously had any understanding of the terms or, the timing or any of it, I was already intuitively and instinctively creating stories around this principle. And that just blew my mind, right? I mean, obviously there was room to grow and improve and, tighten the nuance and stuff, which, I've been studying and doing, for the last 10 years or whatever it's been at this point. Longer than that, it's closer to 15. But yeah, so that was just completely changed, honestly, the trajectory of my life. Not just because it allowed me to, really become passionate about teaching story structure and story theory, but also because it really changed just my whole view of how the world worked and how story was a reflection of life, and life was, ultimately a reflection, not a reflection, but was that pattern was what we were then seeing and translating into story structure. So my first lesson was, again, story structure is not just important, but that it's amazing. And I think that can be something that sometimes writers miss because they're so focused on this is the rules and the way to do it, rather than why. Why is this important? And for me, digging into the why has been, one of the greatest joys and pleasures of my life, not just as a writer, but just generally. And that kind of leads into lesson number 2, because after discovering story structure and how that just completely impacted my whole view of story, the next step for that was the character arcs. And the lesson here for me, the lesson I learned, was that character arcs will change your life. And that, as I started digging into character arcs, and where that really solidified for me was that Writer's Digest had asked me to do, they had a short series of what they called annotated classics, where the one they asked me to work on was Jane Eyre, and they would take these classic novels and have someone go through and, from a writing perspective, annotate it and put in, kind of comment on what the author was doing, and sometimes the historical pertinence and things like that. So that book's still in print. If you're interested, you can find it. It's the Writer's Digest annotated classic Jane Eyre. Anyway, so it was in studying Jane Eyre for this project, and just going through, looking at the story structure, looking at what Charlotte Bronte did with it, that I really began to see and understand how character arc worked. How, the character evolves from this lie or the limited perspective that they believe into a more expanded perspective or the thematic truth within the story, and the beats of that and how it interacted with story structure. That book completely changed my life. I never looked at character arc the same way. I would go on, of course, to write my book, Creating Character Arcs. But not only was that exciting, again, from a writing perspective and being able to like get under the hood and see how character arc worked at a story level, it also was one of those things that changed my life, because again, we have this partnership and this reflection between life and story. And in being able to understand how character arc worked in story, it also completely changed how I looked at transformation within my own life. And I began to be able to recognize, the character arcs that I was taking, and this is the lie I'm believing, and this is what I'm overcoming. And maybe I'm on a disillusionment arc over here, and maybe I'm on a flat arc over here. And it's just, for me anyway, has been a very useful and empowering way to view my own life. We hear this thing about be the hero of your own life. And I think being able, as a writer, being able to take all of these tools and techniques that we use in enhancing our stories and our characters, and being able to see our own lives through that lens, is just an incredible gift. And then of course we get to mine all that and bring it back and put it into our stories, and be able to bring a deeper understanding of what our characters are going through and the steps of transformation that creates that verisimilitude within our stories. Purely on a practical level, the two most important things that I have learned as a writer and that have completely changed how I operate within the craft are story structure, plot structure, and character arc. And I've written books about both of them. So if you want more information on either of those topics, I will leave the links for that down below here on YouTube. The third lesson is a little more about the writing life than actually writing techniques. And it is that the lesson is define your own idea of success. Define your own why for why you're doing this. And for me, and I think for many writers who want to or are able to make the transition into writing full time, it's important to understand what your goals are and to be in touch with your own values. Because number one, there's a lot of resistance, right? It's an uphill climb in many ways. And, there'll be lots of no's. There'll be lots of things where you're, if you're querying agents or whatever, well, you'll be rejected and you won't be able to gain, entry into traditional publishing. If you're self-publishing, it's easy enough to put your book out there, but it's much harder to actually sell copies. And the point being that, the writing life can be very discouraging. It can feel like you're not making any traction if you're putting all of your emphasis on how many books am I selling? How much money am I making? And, I think all of that's important. I'm able to do this full time, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. But it's been a long road, to get where I'm at. And particularly in the beginning, when you don't have a lot to show for what you're doing, and maybe other people are judging you for different choices that you're making, whether it's, you're choosing to self-publish. That was a big thing when I was first starting out. It wasn't as legit as it is now. And so there was a lot of judgment just based on, choosing to go that route. It automatically made you a less than writer. And then no matter how successful you are, at any given point, there's always somebody who's more successful, somebody who's making more money, selling more books, having bigger book signings, or, winning more awards or whatever, or just you look at their writing and you're like, their writing's amazing. I would like to be able to write like this. And I think just because writing in itself is, number one, it's such a vulnerable act. And number two, it's very hard to judge it. Like there is no hard and fast rule for saying this measures up, right? There's no level of books you can sell that says you've made it, really. There's no, guidelines that somebody can apply to your story and say, this is a perfect story. There's always something. There's always something where you're like, it could, am I measuring up? Is it good enough? And because there's so much rejection involved and so much uncertainty in how you're able to measure your success, something that I had to learn really early on in order to survive in the business was to define my success by my own terms, to really dig down deep inside of myself and look at why am I doing what I'm doing? Is it to sell X amount of books? Is it to make X amount of money? Is it to win a particular award? Is it to be traditionally published? And to get really real with myself about choices I was making and why, and to be able to identify where I was making choices that weren't actually in alignment with my own values and desires, that were just based on some, projected ideal out there that seem to be what everybody else would respect as, an established writer. And being able to do that, and it's a process. It's something that I refine all the time in my life. And certainly, as my career has progressed and gotten more stable, and I have seen a certain measure of success, it's gotten easier, to be able to kind of deal with some of the demons of doubt. But even early on, and even, when things aren't going the way I want them to, being able to kind of come back to this lodestone of, why am I doing this? What is my guiding principle? What is underlying it? That has always been really helpful to me, to be able to measure, like, is the effort I'm putting into whatever worth it? Is the stress worth it? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It totally depends on my value system. And also, I think you have to have like the ability to advance those goals. They need to be really realistic in the beginning, to a certain point. I mean, if your long and term goal is to be a New York Times bestseller, then, that's probably not going to something that's going to happen in the first year. So you set smaller goals. But it's not so much about whether or not you're reaching your goals as whether or not you are in alignment with why you're doing what you're doing. Are you writing for the love of it? Are you writing because you have something to say? Are you writing because you believe stories are important? Are you writing because you believe it's important for you to tell this story? I used to say that I would write stories even if I knew no one would ever read them. And that's still true. Sometimes it's easier to write stories if you know no one's going to read them. But that was something that was always a guiding principle for me. It's like, I'm not doing this to be read. And that's not true for everyone, and that's fine. But that was for me, being able to always come back to that and to remember that I'm doing this for, my own reasons, for, because I have something to say, because the stories want out. That was always really helpful. And like, when there was judgment or there was criticism, or there was just some amazing writer that, I was comparing myself to, that I could come back to that and just remember, no, I'm doing me. And I think particularly, again, when you're like going to do this for the long haul, you have to have, some kind of foundation like that to keep you on track, so that you know where you're at and you know where you're going. All right, lesson number 4 is writer's block is a part of the process. If you have been following me for any length of time, you know that starting around 2018, I went through a massive bout of writer's block that lasted several years. It coincided with a difficult time in my life. There was just a lot of stressful things going on, and writing just kind of fell apart for me. My fiction writing fell apart for me for a while. And it was very disconcerting. I mean, this had been such a huge part of my identity up to that point, and then suddenly I couldn't write, and I was questioning my value system. Do I want to keep doing this? And what I've learned as I've worked through this process and have, been able to overcome that block and return to writing fiction, is that really I think we stigmatize writer's block and we make it sound like it's something that should never happen. And I do think it can become something that's definitely undesirable. But a lot of that is because we don't recognize kind of the ebb and flow of creativity, and that, rest periods are important. They're part of the process. And that if you are writing full time, there's this pressure kind of to just write constantly, produce book after book after book after book. And that can be, for some people, maybe that's your natural rhythm and that's great. But for most of us, for me, that's not true. At the end, because I did push really hard for many years, the well just kind of emptied out, and I didn't have the creative juice to come up with another story. And so because of my lifestyle up until that point, the writer's block was extreme. But I think if we can kind of begin to realize like being a writer doesn't mean that you always have to be writing. That's something people ask me all the time. Like, do I have to write every day to be a writer? And my answer is absolutely not. I mean, you can write, for 2 weeks out of a year. And if you're like really into it and what you're producing is really important to you, you wrote it. Of course you're a writer. And just naturally, if you are a professional writer, there will be, it's a job. You have to take some time off. And more than that, creativity is something that rises up from the subconscious, right? It's not something that we necessarily have conscious control over. And therefore, we have to give it space to come to us. We have to cultivate lifestyles that, allow for it to really thrive and grow. I think for me, this has been a huge, huge lesson for me because I am, naturally have a personality that tends toward workaholicism. So it's been a huge lesson for me to recognize that down periods of creativity are important, that they're a part of the cycle. And that, if the up times when we are really creative and we're producing, are going to be really full and rich, then necessarily it's like the cycle of the seasons. We have to come down into winter and, be willing to, take time and space without constantly trying to harness our creativity as if it's an endless resource. Rather than recognizing it as a gift and a partner and something that needs to be nourished and taken care of. All right, so lesson number 5, which is related, is take care of your creative health. So I think if you have ever gone through an extensive period of creative burnout, then you know, right? If you know, you know. And it's brutal. It's so difficult and scary and sad. Because number one, creativity is a life force, and to lose connection with that is very devastating, just on a purely primal level. And then to whatever degree it's a major identity for you, I am a writer, to lose connection with that and be in a place where you wonder if you're ever going to get it back is very scary. You don't know who you are anymore. And that in itself, for me anyway, was an extremely valuable process and was very, I learned so much about myself and experienced so many ego deaths. And ultimately, it was full of richness and blessing, but it's still very scary and very difficult. And finally, if you make your money doing this, as this is your livelihood, then if you'd get disconnected from your creativity and your ability to be productive with that, that's endangering your very survival at a certain level. And that is definitely scary. So it's really important. I think, we hear so much these days about taking care of your mental health. And I think more and more we're also hearing about taking care of your emotional health. And part and parcel in that, but another nuance is I think we need to start thinking more consciously about taking care of our creative health. Because as creatives, and really just as human beings, because human beings are innately creative. So whether you're expressing that through whatever, but writing, obviously, in this context, storytelling, we have to take care of that. We have to cultivate a lifestyle and an awareness that allows that to thrive. And I think that looks a little different for everybody. I think honestly, just having good habits in general, taking care of your physical health and your mental health and your emotional health clears your energy. It clears the space in your life to allow that creativity to emerge. Because creativity, you can think of it like giving birth, right? It's a very vulnerable act, and you don't do it out in the open where there's dangers and there's all kinds of stuff happening. In the olden days, you go to a cave, you go to someplace really private, and there's probably people guarding the entrance. Creating a story or a piece of art is kind of like that. Like, it doesn't want to come out if it doesn't feel safe. So if there's all this stuff going on in our brains, stress and distraction and all of this, it's hard to birth something. It's hard, to get into that space where you can birth the story idea and put in the work to not just like type out the words, but to channel it up from your own deep creativity. For me, particularly in these years since my writer's block, it's been a huge lesson and a huge process of learning how to cultivate a creative life. And it's an ongoing thing. I still want to be productive. I still enjoy being productive and love doing the work aspects of my job and showing up for that. And, it's great. But I also, have learned to put so much more emphasis and care into taking care of myself and doing it in service to the creativity. And also specifically taking care of that, filling the well. But also, something that I've learned about burnout is really, it's not so much that the well is empty as it is that other things are like, it's clogged with junk. Basically, it's too full. It's not that the well is empty, it's that it's too full with junk. And so it's been a process of like clearing stuff out. Sometimes that's, things like emotions and stuff like that. But sometimes it's just life stuff. Like there's too much going on. And you need to be able to say, no, that would be great. That sounds like fun or whatever. I feel pressured to do it, whatever. And being able to set those boundaries with yourself so that, again, there's space, there's downtime, there's the ability to just be with yourself and with your creativity, to just, stare out the window and daydream. Things like that. I think we miss that sometimes in hustle culture. And certainly the writing industry in general has a lot of hustle culture. But really the essence and the foundation and the ground of what we do as creatives requires stillness. It requires space. And we have to be willing to take care of our creative health if it's going to supply and fuel all the things that we want to do and put out into the world. All right, so this is lesson what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Lesson 6 is that your fellow writers are not competition. And this was never a huge problem for me, but I've definitely refined my perspective on it over the years. And again, because it's often so undefined what it means to be successful as a writer, and because we often aren't sure for ourselves what we're trying to get out of it, and so we kind of borrow definitions from the world or from other people, who are, only looking up to people who are making millions of dollars and, selling massive amounts of books and getting huge movie deals and things like that. And even then, on a smaller level, people in our genre maybe, or, maybe our writers group, somebody else gets a book deal before we do, something like that. It can be really easy to feel less than. And, automatically by that token feel a certain resentment or envy toward, our fellow writers, and feel like, well, because they got what I wanted or they got something better than I did, then, it's somehow endangering my opportunity to do the same. I think particularly within the writing field, this is categorically untrue. For one thing, every time, somebody reads another book that they love, every time a reader has a great reading experience, that really all that's doing is opening the door for another book to come into their lives. They're thinking, that was great, I want to do that again. And they're looking out there for something else. And that could be your book, So whenever a fellow writer is successful, it's a win for everybody. And I think that's a really important way to look at it, because the demand for stories is insatiable. It's only a matter of if you can put out, good ones that people like and get them into, readers' hands. I think being able to kind of look at it that way can help with sometimes this tendency we have to resent fellow writers' success or let it make us feel less than. Because really, I think if we flip that on its head and start looking at, our fellow writers, particularly those we admire or want to be like, to view them as inspiration, right? They are way showers for what is possible for us. And more than that, you can study what they do, right? They're presenting a model of how to do it, at least to a certain point. And you can study that and again, figure out what fits you, what is actually in alignment with, why you're doing this and what you're doing. I really think that being able to kind of reframe any of this insecurity that arises in response to a fellow writer's success or our view of them as being, a really good writer, and reframing it into an opportunity to, get where we want to go, to, view them as someone who's ahead of us on the path and therefore breaking trail, right? They're breaking trail and showing the way for us. Okay, lesson number 7. Writing is the most challenging mirror of all. So kind of, just in line with the theme that writing is all about learning lessons, right? And I think that when we dig deep into the lifestyle and we really commit to it, and we can use it in kind of this meta way to really grow our own lives. And I think writing by its nature is difficult. By its nature, it requires discipline and consistency. By its nature, it shines a light on the parts of ourselves that are ouchy or insecure, or, where our ego is in control. And also by its nature, it's extremely vulnerable, right? We have to be very brave to be able to go into the authenticity of being able to, show parts of ourselves, whether it's our characters or whatever else, that we're putting into these stories, and to share them with other people who, could say or think anything about it. We are putting ourselves out there in such a real and raw and honest way. And that requires profound courage. Now, sometimes we don't look before we leap. We don't realize what we're doing. We put the book out there and it's like, whoa. And I feel that way every time I put a new project out, a new book or whatever. It's always like, I'm happily writing it. And then I put it out there and it's like, oh my gosh, what have I done? But for me, the writing life has been such a incredible experience for really deepening my understanding and my relationship of myself. Basically, like, don't become a writer and go deep in this lifestyle unless you're able and willing and want, to have the full experience of human life and what it means to be here, and the range of emotions, and the ups and the downs, and to face those deep challenges, because being a writer will offer those challenges, and they're not insurmountable. They're definitely not. This is not meant to be like, oh, writing's too hard. It's glorious. It's just that it's not easy. And I think that that's something that I've learned and will probably always be learning in different nuances as I go through life and continue to write, is that there's always more to learn, and that it's such a mirror for myself and my own experience. And as long as I'm brave enough to look in the mirror, there's so much there for me to be able to learn and expand and to grow into. The never-ending story of our own lives is basically what it's reflecting back to us. Okay, so finally, lesson number 8. This is a quote from Anne Lamott in her book, Bird by Bird, which I just have always really appreciated and loved. And what she says is, being published isn't all it's cracked up to be, but writing is. And I just come back to that again and again. I mean, being published is great. I fully love it, right? Not dissing it at all. But at the end of the day, again, it comes back to knowing why you're doing what you're doing. And for me, that's not why I'm doing it. And, but the journey, right? Basically, that's the idea. It's the idea that it's not about the destination. It's about the journey. And for me, when I can stay in that place and remember that and be present with the journey, then it just makes the entire experience and what I'm able to bring to my stories or to my teaching so much richer and deeper. And just more valuable, I think, to myself and hopefully to others as well. You can kind of see a theme in all of my 8 lessons. And I suppose basically we could sum it up as that for me, writing has been so much more than just about telling stories or writing books. It has been this incredible journey through the depths, the heights, the lows of life itself. And for me, being able to look at it that way and see it in that light is so powerful and so exciting. It's just exciting. I hope that some of that's food for thought, that it's interesting or helpful to you on your writing journey. I'd love to hear some of the most important lessons that you have learned in your writing life. You can leave those down below. And I will see you again in the next video. If you'd like to stay in touch until then the best way to do that is to sign up for my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll receive weekly emails with links to my weekly blog post and podcast, where I go in depth on all things writing and storytelling. And you can also connect with me on Instagram at author KM Weiland, where I post behind the scenes photos and some insights and epiphanies, just little odds and ends that I don't really post anywhere else. So I will see you around. Happy writing.